This is Berkeley Talks, a UC Berkeley news podcast from the Office of Communications and Public Affairs that features lectures and conversations at UC Berkeley. You can follow Berkeley Talks wherever you listen to your podcasts. New episodes come out every other Friday. Also, we have another show, Berkeley Voices. This season on the podcast, we're exploring the theme of transformation. In 8 episodes, we're looking at how transformation of ideas, of research, of perspective shows up in the work that happens every day at Berkeley. You can find all of our podcast episodes on UC Berkeley News at news.berkeley.edu/podcasts.
All right. A good tech check. Hello and welcome. Good evening. It's good to be here with you all in person, as well as with each and every one of you who's at home. Some announcements that are more applicable to those of us who are in the room is that we will be having food and drink after the session tonight, so we invite you warmly to stay, get to know each other and us, get to know everybody. And the second part is that there are books available for purchase, and there will be time for signing. John and Stephen will be signing the books after the talk, so please feel empowered, encouraged to pick yourself up one and to have it signed. Pick up 2, John says. Pick up 2. All right, so welcome to tonight's book talk with John Powell and Stephen Menendian on their most recent book release, Belonging Without Othering: How We Save Ourselves and the World. I've just been informed, but am not at all surprised, that this book was chosen as the best book of the year by Amazon's editor Best Pick. So it did not disappoint. So tonight we're going to do a little bit of celebrating and recognizing the great works that are written about in this book. But we're not going to leave it there, because the power of belonging without othering is an invitation into practice, into truly building the world that we all seek to achieve and to be a part of. So we invite you through tonight and for always to join us in being a co-contributor, a co-creator of a world where belonging without othering is realized. So, tonight's event is sponsored by the Othering and Belonging Institute with promotional support from Berkeley Law and Berkeley Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. And we just want to take a moment to acknowledge this beautiful space that we're all in together, the Alumni House, and give thanks for the fact that we're able to be here in person and virtually together on this beautiful campus. So, many of you are likely familiar with who the Othering and Belonging Institute is, and I thought I'd take a moment just to kind of shape who's holding this event and who is the institute that John and Stephen are representing. So I do want to take a moment to shout out, we're many people, and many of them are in this room tonight. So if you are part of the OBI team, maybe put your hand up and let the folks see where you are, who you are. Yes. Welcome. And please be sure to find them and to talk to them. We all represent different bodies of work that the Institute is advancing, and so you'll get a different perspective of our work and experience of it through each person that you have the opportunity to engage with. So the Institute at large has been at Berkeley for about 14 years now, with John Powell as the lead, and Stephen Menendian as one of the first employees of the Institute. We see othering as the problem of our time and belonging as the solution. The Othering and Belonging Institute advances groundbreaking approaches to transforming structural marginalization and equality. We are scholars, organizers, communicators, researchers, artists, and policymakers, all committed to building a world where all people belong. So, who am I? My name is Ashley Gallegos. I use she and they pronouns, and I have the great good fortune to work with the Othering and Belonging Institute, leading a body of work called Places of Belonging. I've worked with the Institute now for 3 years, and have had the distinct pleasure and opportunity to learn from the works that these two and many others have created on belonging, and find a sweet spot of turning that research into application with institutions, groups, and networks from all over. So, I've introduced myself, but I'm only one part of this dynamic trio here to celebrate this book, Belonging Without Othering. So I'd like to introduce our guests of honors. Oh, I'm sorry. I also got a just-in-time update of John's bio, so I'm going to be reading the one hot off the press. We are emergent. Okay, so John A. Powell has been involved in a number of important, innovative projects and frames over the years. He was part of the group that helped introduce the concept of structural racism, which he then referred to as structural radicalization, into the public discourse, as well as implicit bias. He also helped bring equity into the public discourse, and more recently, helped introduce the concept of targeted universalism, and I would add, belonging. John's current work on othering and belonging, with a focus on practical implications as a paradigm shift and in relationship to spirituality. He has started several institutions, including Perception Institute and Perception Practices, the Institute on Race and Poverty, and most recently, the Othering and Belonging Institute. His work is global and national, and he has had a strong implication, or his work has had strong implications both conceptually and also in practice. He has lived and worked all over the world, including Africa, India, South America, and Berkeley. Stephen Menendian. Stephen is the Assistant Director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, where he manages many of the Institute's ongoing research projects and leads major initiatives. Most notably, Stephen spearheaded the Roots of Structural Racism project, a multifaceted, interactive study revealing the persistence of racial residential segregation and its harmful consequences. Released this year, OBI's annual Inclusiveness Index. Stephen is a co-author to the book we're discussing tonight, Belonging Without Othering, and will soon be releasing a book on structural racism in early 2025. Let's give a warm welcome to these two co-authors. So thank you both. Oh, is my mic on? Yes. Thank you both for joining us tonight and for, I think, opening up the space and your hearts and minds and expertise to share with a room full of folks and plenty online. What I was thinking about is like texturizing what you've written on the pages and rewritten on the pages and giving, I don't know, of yourself and your conversation and the way you're thinking about what you wrote in a way that is almost a one-time offer. Tonight's experience will not be able to be replicated in another time. So with that being said, I thought I might start with the question that does a little bit of framing of othering and belonging themselves. So how did you come to these frameworks and the dynamics of othering and belonging as the place we want to go?
Well, first of all, thank all of you for being here. So we have what we call the moonshot, which is in the next 15 years to create a world where belonging is a global norm. Belonging without othering is a global norm, not just a U.S. norm. And we know that's an ambitious goal, and we know it doesn't happen unless we all do it. So we think of this not just work that we're involved in, we think of this as a movement. And it's a movement that's actually been in motion for thousands of years. And we've sort of done the research, and you'll see some of it in the book if you have a chance to look at the book. But when you look at major religious movements or major philosophical movements, literally over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, virtually all of them, at their core, had the concept of belonging. They didn't sometimes use the word literally, and oftentimes did not. But what they did in that was to create a sense of belonging with the structures, with the technology, for a particular group. And at the same time, they said if you weren't part of that particular group, you were the other. And bad things could happen to the other. I'm going to deviate from I don't have any prepared remarks, so I don't know what I'm deviating from. But I am deviating. So I was recently in a conversation with Pastor Roberts. So you may know him. He was at our conference. He's a really big deal in the evangelical movement in the United States and around the world. And he came to our conference, and he said, my friend said, why would you go to Berkeley? I mean, there's sinners in Berkeley. And he not only came to the conference, but he decided to come back and have lunch and a meeting with the sinner again. It was actually a very interesting meeting. We're probably going to do some work together. But at one point in the meeting, he said, beautiful compliment, but also a provocation. He said, so Professor Powell, I've been talking to you for 2 or 3 hours. You just have, almost more than anyone I've met, you have Christ's energy about you. He said, so why did you leave the church? Won't you consider coming back to God? And I said, Pastor Roberts, I appreciate the invitation and the compliment. I think of myself as a pretty radical agnostic. I don't believe or disbelieve in very much. I don't think it's relevant. I think what we do is actually relevant. What we believe is of little consequence to me. And I said, but when I was a young lad and spending time reading the Bible, I read about a place called Sodom and Gomorrah, where God decided that this place was wicked and decided that the people there should no longer exist. He was going to wipe them out. And in the process, he found a handful of people that seemed okay. And he said, leave, because I'm going to destroy this city. But don't look back. And some of you may know the story. And so they're leaving, and God is destroying the city, and a couple of them look back. And he turns them into bags of salt. And I said to Pastor Roberts, I said, bags of salt. Now, I'm just not down with that. We're talking about othering, but bags of salt? So I can't come back to that kind of God. And he said, he sort of laughed. He said, I think we can still work together. So really, the thing that's unique about what we're pushing is not belonging, because belonging is in Christianity, it's in Judaism, it's in Hinduism, it's in Buddhism, it's in Jainism, it's in Confucianism, it's in the teaching of Immanuel Kant. It's everywhere. It's in the creation of the nation state. So belonging is around in its various forms everywhere, but it's always with that add-on and then the other, the categorical, the infidel, the non-Christian, the heathens, the barbarians, which don't deserve respect, don't deserve recognition, refuse to recognize their humanity, except if they meet certain conditions. And so what we're saying is that this is a great arc that we've been on, but it's incomplete because the arc has to be belonging without othering. And the without othering is doing a lot of the work. So wherever you other, that's where the work has to be done. And when I say whenever you, I mean you individually, I mean you collectively, I mean you, the nation, I mean you, wherever we do that. And what we try to say in the book, pushed by some of our friends and colleagues and fellow travelers, is why the focus on humanity? And some of you may know my work, and I say I'm not a humanist. I don't believe the world, the universe is human-centered. It's too big for that, and we're too small. We're part of something. And so the word human comes from the word humus, which means of the earth. So we are of the earth. And so when we talk about belonging, we're not just talking about belonging to each other, we're talking about belonging to the earth itself. And I don't think we'll ever get there, certainly not in my lifetime, but it's a really important aspiration. It's a really important vision. And not just at an interpersonal level, but at a structural, institutional, cultural level. And we'll keep coming up short, but we'll keep moving in that direction. And if we can get, my visa straightened out, I'll be going to India in November to they have a movement there around belonging. And they say this is what Gandhi was really talking about. And Cecily and I, who met earlier, talking to people from Israel, who are talking about the problem in the Middle East should be reframed in terms of belonging. And we had a wonderful time with people in Belfast. And we said, how did you move away from the troubles to what you're doing now? And they did. Not done, never will be done. But they did. They put down the guns. And I think many of you know that the head of Belfast right now, head of Northern Ireland, is a Catholic. And one of the ways they did that was to put a stake in the ground. And part of the people who put the stake in the ground were not just women, they were women, but they were mothers, because they understood what it means to be killing people. It means killing their sons and daughter and their family. And so they basically said to the men, enough of that, enough of the sort of us versus them. We have to move to something different. And we had them at our conference, and we are looking forward to learning from them and continuing on the journey. So, and many of you, the National Equity Project, I know many of you in the work you're doing. So I'm really heartened and pleased that you're here, but more importantly, that you're part of this important movement.
Well, many of you are new faces to me, so I hope to meet many of you over the course of the evening and hear from you. And I also want to thank you for coming here, not just to hear us, and not just to engage these ideas, but to be participants in this vision that John just described of making belonging a global norm. We can't do this without all of you. And not just as passive participants, but as active participants in pushing that forward. So thank you for joining us in that. It's been a strange and unusual journey, Ashley, towards this framework. Originally, when we came to Berkeley, we saw a pattern. We would see this trope where someone would say, X is the new civil rights movement. No, LGBTQ rights is the new civil rights movement. Trans rights is the next civil rights movement. Disability rights is the next civil rights movement. There was a grasping for the language and the legitimacy of the civil rights movement. And that helped us see that there was some common thread there. There was some disabling structural arrangement that marginalized people. There's some common mechanisms. And therefore, there could also be a common solution that didn't wash out the particularities. And we kind of grasped for what that was, and we realized that the othering processes might be different, but they share strong commonalities in prejudice, in hatred, in segregation, in denialism, in non-citizenship, in these different mechanisms. But then I think the really profound shift was moving and hitting upon belonging and really realizing there are lots of forms of belonging that are available on offer in the world today. The problem is many of them are pernicious. So you can read about what it's like going to a MAGA rally, right? But there's a clear set of villains there. Our vision of belonging is one that has no villains. Everyone can belong. It doesn't mean that there aren't forces that we have to grapple with or contend with, like ethno-nationalism. But there's no categorical villain. And that's profoundly different, I think, morally, and also in terms of vision and philosophy of what we're trying to reach for. So this is, I think, a very radical vision in the sense that there's really no place in the world that we can point to that's realized this, but we don't have a choice. And I'm so thrilled to hear about John going to India. India, the largest country in the world, 1.5 billion people, the most diverse country in the world. If we can't figure this out in places like India or the US, how are we ever going to figure this out? So these are places that are grappling with this right now. And we're seeing what doesn't work. And more importantly, working with Ashley, we're trying to pilot and figure out what does work.
Thank you both for your reflections and answers. My next question, I think you've touched on it a little bit, but I'm going to ask it for the sake of offering it to see if there's any nuances you want to pull out that maybe were not shared on the first answer. So what is the paradigm shift that belonging without othering aims to create that is different from our current state?
Well, there are a number of strands we could pull on, so I'll just put on a couple. So we're at Berkeley, and at Berkeley, you're supposed to say something new that no one said before. You're supposed to make up words, all kinds of things. And then you're supposed to critique things, So one of the critiques that we get a lot is that just logically, if you have something that's part of something, you have to have something that's not part of something, right? So is it even conceivable that you could have belonging without othering? And a lot of smart people, and we're constantly trying to learn and co-create, so we listen. We don't think we have all the answers. But people will say evolutionarily that we are programmed, we're wired to other. People oftentimes, I'm part of a group called More in Common. Some of you may know of it. And they did a beautiful study called The Hidden Tribes. And they talked about tribalism that's actually manifesting itself in all of what people call polarization. Now, I think there's something wrong with both the way we talk about tribalism and the way we talk about polarization. And I'll just give you 30 seconds. It's in the book. What people are reaching for is that we were in tribes for almost 2 million years. We've only come out of tribes in the last 10,000 years. And that, in a sense, our evolutionary processes were being made while we were in tribes. And so we are naturally tribal. And so that sort of leans into the notion that we're just wired, us and them. And that's really interesting. It's just wrong. And it's wrong for some obvious reasons when you think about it. First of all, most tribes, although there's a book called The History of Everything, that suggests that the way we understand tribes was always wrong. But the general proposition is that tribes were people that you were with your entire life. You had face-to-face contact. They ranged from anywhere from 50 to 200. And that was it. That was your tribe. And your tribe, your trust of each other, your familiarity with each other, was that you were constantly depending upon each other. So when we talk about the conflict that's happening today in the world, and these cleavages, they're along the issue of race. Well, just in the United States, there are 350 million people. Close to 200 plus million of them call themselves white. That's not a tribe. 200 million people is not a tribe. There are 2.5 billion people in the world that call themselves Christians. There are 2 billion people in the world that call themselves Muslim. That has nothing to do with a tribe. Most of those people don't speak the same language. They will never meet each other. They eat different food. How are they a tribe? And then if we push even further, we realize that war, which is ravaging the world right now, in the name of authoritarianism and polarization, I think it's better to call it fragmentation, not polarization. War is ravaging the world. War is a modern invention. Tribes did not engage in war. They engaged in conflicts, but the conflicts were episodic, they were short, and they were done. These things that go on for months and years, the 100-Year War, could not even been conceivable for tribes. So, and then there's this funny notion that we sort of look down on indigenous people. That was part of modernity. You know, they were tribal. They didn't wear enough clothes. The women showed their breasts. They were hunter-gatherers. And they, if they had a god, there were many gods. They believed gods were in the trees, were in the animals. They believed they were part of nature. And so that's all associated with tribalism. And many of us think some of those things might have been okay, even better. So when we say tribalism, we're taking our most pernicious behavior and projecting it on people that didn't have that behavior. We got to own that the tribes did not create the nuclear bomb. That was a modern civilization scientific phenomena. Tribes did not create nation states and the kind of pernicious breaking that we have. So what's new is basically saying we got to own this stuff. So if we're not propelled to this by the deep wiring of tribes, then maybe something else can happen. And this, I'll stop for now and just say this. There's a book by McMahon called Equality, the History of an Elusive Idea, and another book by someone named Harari, which I'm sure many of you know, called Sapien and others. And what they argue is something quite interesting. They say that about 70,000 years ago, humans of various sorts have been around about 2 million years. Not Homo sapiens, but humans. And we were sort of evolutionarily being pushed along. Evolutionary determinism, if you will. And about 70,000 years ago, something happened. Sapiens, not all humans, but sapiens, developed the ability to imagine and tell stories. And in that new ability, they could tell stories about things that hadn't existed before. They could tell stories about way of trading. And they told stories about something called money. Money's just made up. That's a story. It's not real. It's only real because we invest in it. They could tell stories about religion. They could tell stories about gods. They could tell stories about each other so that instead of being 20, 50, 200, there were thousands. And that ability to imagine and tell new stories, which also created new relationships, new collaboration, is what gave birth to modernity, if you will. And so our secret gift is telling stories to collaborate. And that's not necessitated by nature. How far can we go with those stories? We can go as far as we can imagine. So what we're trying to do is actually release the imagination so that people can imagine a world where everyone belongs. And for those who insist that, well, if you have a circle, you have something, what's outside of it? For those of you who like physics will realize that the universe, at least according to some physicists, is a giant sphere with nothing outside of it. What's outside of the universe? Unless you believe in the multiverse, nothing's outside of the universe. So my point is this: we don't know how far we can go. And we're asking for a different paradigm. And we're saying the paradigm, if we can hold on to the paradigm, that's 90% of the work. If we can believe in it. I'll end just by saying this. I could say more, but think about the Declaration of Independence. 250 years ago, a committee, including Thomas Jefferson, penned the Declaration of Independence. One of the statements in the Declaration of Independence is that we hold certain truths to be self-evident. what's self-evident 250 years ago, Mr. Jefferson? That all men are created equal. That's not self-evident to me when you have 600 people enslaved. So how is that self-evident? And so some people say Jefferson was a huge hypocrite. I think that's too simple. It's a more complex story. But he also, whether he was a hypocrite or not, whether he's complex or not, many historians would say that's the most important phrase in the American lexicon. It put us on a journey. In a time where most people were enslaved or serfs, whether they're white, black, or otherwise, Jefferson suggested that all men, all people are created equal. There was no physical manifestation of that. You couldn't look around the world and say, yeah, just look at France. All the people there are equal. Or maybe not France, what about England? There was no place. And yet that has oriented much of our political history for the last 250 years. We could do the same thing with belonging.
Just to add to that, I think partly what John is saying is that when the Declaration of Independence was written, that statement could not have been less true. But as an aspiration, it oriented our society, and over the ensuing 250 years, that aspiration has motivated us to try and realize it, even though we're still not there. And our book is about how much further we have to go. Another thing on tribalism, it's interesting, and we discuss it in chapter 2 in the book, is that anthropological studies of tribes showed that in many ways tribes are much more egalitarian than current societies. And John referenced The Dawn of Everything, which is a book that sort of excavates that history. Part of it is that for traditional societies, so-called traditional societies, it depends how leaders behave. Do leaders cultivate norms of openness and inclusion, or do they cultivate and represent and model norms of exclusion and toughness? Really, it depends in large part on what our leaders do, as we can see these debates playing out in our societies today. We have demagogues, some of the fiercest, nastiest we've ever seen in our society. In fact, some of the anti-immigrant sentiment that you're seeing out of one of the major political campaigns right now is, in my opinion, the worst I've ever seen in American history, even worse than the 2016 campaign, even worse than the Know Nothing campaigns of the 19th century, even worse than Pappy Cannon campaigns of the 90s. So what does that tell us about where we are and where we have to go? I think the paradigm shift here, and I'm going to borrow a phrase that John used in our book, is that we want to move beyond inclusion. Inclusion is like the guest model. You're right? You have a party, you invite people in, but you're the host, and guests are provisional, they're welcome so far as it's on your say-so. We want to make everyone party planners. We want to redesign the institution, we want to redesign the calendar. We want to make people co-creators of these institutions that we participate and inhabit, and not just guests. And so that's what we have to move beyond, is the narrow version of inclusion. And we tell a story about how the Ivy League institutions in the late 60s finally decided to admit women and what that was like. Tokenized, marginalized, couldn't participate in the social clubs. That's inclusion. We want to move beyond that. So this is a paradigm shift. And I think we don't just want belonging. Because you can have belonging based on othering. And the demagogues show how to do that, right? We want belonging without othering. It's a profound difference.
Let me add two other quick things, and then you have more questions. The other thing that we're very clear on is that everybody belongs. So sometimes we get in fights, it's like winners and losers. And whoever the losers are, they don't belong. And sometimes that's along gender preference, sometimes it's along race, sometimes along religion. We're saying, no, everybody belongs. And we had a public conference some years ago, and somebody said, what about the Koch brothers? Yes, they belong. It doesn't mean you embrace everything they say. It doesn't mean we won't struggle over ideas. But everyone belongs. There's two quick things. That may sound very idealistic. How does everybody belong? At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 4 countries that had eliminated the death penalty. Now there are 144 countries. Countries, and if you sort of watch them go through this projection, one of the things they discuss is it right for the state to take a human life? And sometimes they discuss it in moral terms, sometimes they discuss it in utilitarian terms, sometimes they discuss it in religious terms. But most of those 144 countries come to the conclusion that it's not right for the state to take a human life. There's some contradictions because many of them still have armies and whatever. But when they do that, they don't say, we're not going to take any human life unless you're the Koch brothers, unless you're a jerk, unless you're a fascist or a communist. They don't make exceptions. They say all life, all life. That's an amazing thing that has happened over the last 100 years, saying no life can be taken by the state. In our neighbor Canada, not only have they eliminated the death penalty, but they've eliminated solitary confinement. They looked at how long is it possible to put another human being into solitary confinement and treat them humanely. The United States has embraced that question, and they were like maybe 250 days. And Canada said 0. Canada's not so different from us in some ways, so can we actually state that? The last thing I'll say that's a paradigm shift is that in this space, in this time, it's easy to believe in othering. It's easy to believe in the power of breaking and othering because we see it all around us. And it looks like sometimes they're winning. We see authoritarian leaders become more popular in Germany and in France and in South Africa, in India. It's a global phenomenon. And so it's like, is it naive then to be talking about belonging when othering is being supercharged? So here's the thing. Most othering is in service of belonging. Yeah, interesting, huh? People other in order to belong. It's a misguided attempt to belong. You want to belong? Hate those people. You want to belong? Kill those people. And so the very purpose that a lot of people embrace othering is a misguided attempt to belong. So even at the foundation of that othering is still a desire, a need, a yearning to belong. But without the imagination that they can have belonging without othering.
Thank you. I love seeing all of your faces, just enthralled. And I want to thank you for that. It's beautiful to see and to witness. And two, just to plant a reminder seed of my invitation at the start of each of you being a co-creator. And I can share that, when listening to Stephen and to John, there's a lot of big ideas that reach my body, my mind, my heart, all at the same time. And so I just want to extend the reminder to, take in what you're hearing tonight. Maybe if we want to be sure to make you a part of this, and we'll have time for questions. So I guess this is just my plug to each and every one of you to sit with what might be rising for you as a question or a curiosity, something you'd like to unpack together, so that you can bring it forth when we go to Q&A near the end. But before then, I am going to ask a few more questions. Okay. So when I'm thinking about belonging, and I think about how it as a term, sometimes for right or wrong, I say it feels like it's having a moment, right? Like we've seen one of our researchers within the Institute, Shad, has done research on how belonging as a topic, as articles, as books, has been progressing in the last 10 years. And we're seeing, when I look at the graph, like a really steep incline towards the amount of materials being created about belonging. And they tell different stories. Some of them are memoirs and how people come to belonging on their own. Some of them are looking at how this kind of like coined as an intrinsic nature, maybe more closer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where belonging is a fundamental human need for each and every one of us. And then when I think about the Institute's conception of belonging and what this book really also articulates about belonging is the important connection and positionality that structures play, institutions play in each of us, either accessing belonging or being denied belonging, if you will. So in thinking about that, thinking about institutions and how tonight and always we're situated within a university, my mind is being drawn into the current state of DEI and the ever-pressing and present backlash that we're witnessing to their efforts of advancement. And we're seeing universities facing a lot of challenges around their governance, employment. They're seeing reducing in funding related to advancing of their efforts, their social change efforts. And so the question that I'd like to ask is, how does belonging as a framework overcome some of the problems that DEI has faced, including backlash? And what's your hope for how belonging can help drive change forward?
You want to go first?
Nice pass.
The challenge that DEI faces right now is really intense and profound. And we're seeing rollbacks systematically across the country. And the universities are under tremendous strain right now with protests, free speech, funding, crisis. There's so much. And at the same time, these are places, really important places, where these practices get played out. If we can't figure out, how to model belonging or greater DEI here, how can we do it in society writ large? So I think universities are really important places where we've got to figure out how to create a sense of belonging. So this university does climate surveys every year. And they ask students and they ask faculty and staff if they feel as if they are seen, as if they're heard, if they belong, how they feel about classes. And when the responses come in, it's very predictable. The most marginalized groups often feel the least amount of belonging on campus. So how do we change that? Well, we have a number of different ways of doing that. We have bridging practices, we have programming, but we have to. However we do it, we have to change that. I think belonging has immense potential to overcome some of the limitations of traditional DEI. We talked about the limitations of the inclusion model, right? As a guest, how can we really make something much more robust? I think belonging begins to show us how. But I also think there's a different set of stories that can be told about it. One of the more interesting parts of the book, so if we wanted just to sell as many copies of the book as we really wanted to, we probably would just start with chapter 5, just on belonging. But we really wanted people to be grounded in the concept and how we think about othering first. So you have to get to the hard part before you get to the fun part. Because we really wanted your conception of belonging to be grounded in belonging without othering rather than based in. And there's a number of real challenges in society right now, but one is the problem of so-called toxic masculinity. And think about how that's playing out in the election right now. You're seeing all these young men, so-called Gen Zers, swinging towards one side. And what's going on with that? And in the passage in the book, there's a number of passages in the latter chapters about white people. I was telling John, I said, John, people are going to think I wrote this. I say, because it seems like an apologia in some ways for white people. But what John was writing and what we sort of tacked on in terms of gender is that if you design a society and your story, your organizing narrative, John was talking about these collective myths like Harari, what we call organizing narratives, is that all white people are bad or all white people are evil. What do you think is going to happen? You're going to get backlash. You're going to get what we say in the book is that if people don't see themselves in the story, not only will they reject the story, but they will reject it violently. People have to have a place for themselves in that future story. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of young men feel lost. So we have in this society problem of non-belonging isn't just among marginalized people, although it is. It's among everyone. Our societies are shot through with crises of belonging, loneliness, alienation, disconnection, lack of community. And we have to have positive stories. So what we say is, what is the story for young men? There's one story of young men is that men are evil, toxic, and the APA put out this notice that said, traditional masculinity is harmful to men and others, that, it leads to emotional repression among men. And so the stories we have are we have to corral young men, right, confine them and get them to stop doing bad things. But we don't have a positive story for young men. We don't have a positive story of what a healthy masculinity could look like. And that's why, in part, so many young men are lost, because our societies don't tell positive stories. So the belonging story, where everyone belongs, we can tell a complex, nuanced story for everyone and where everyone has a role. And so I think that's where we can begin to move beyond some of the stories that are shot through in DEI, which is just where white people bad, men bad, X group bad. So belonging can give us a fabric, a framework in which we can we can provide a positive space for everyone. That's not the end, though, because then we have to figure out what those scripts are. And we have to do that collectively and together. And we don't presuppose what those are, but we have to create space for that.
So part of your question presupposed that maybe there's a collective agreement as to what is the attack on DEI, and I think the problem is not. But what we know is that it's a strategy, that you always have people distributed across different lines. Some people are really just confused. Some people are not confused, but they want to use, we talk about conflict entrepreneurs. They want to use the toxicity for their own ends. And when critical race theory first started being attacked, first of all, I didn't think it was going to stick, because I thought that's just ridiculous, right? I was wrong. And then I was asked to come on a conservative radio station to talk about critical race theory. And I start out by saying, which is true, that I was at the second meeting of critical race theory. I'm one of the people who had a hand. There's no universal agreement as to what critical race theory is, but there's some trends of it. There's some strands of it. And I started talking about some of those strands. I said, it really is a lean toward structural racialization. And the person is like, basically saying, don't confuse me with the facts. We're not interested in what it's evil. It's saying you don't like white people. It's saying you hate the country. I said, no, it's, and the point is that the person had no interest in really understanding critical race theory. And so part of the attack on DEI, and people said this, they sort of throw stuff up against the wall. What sticks? Okay, now this sticks. Why does it stick, though? One of the reasons it sticks is that we are anxious as a country. We're anxious as a world. We don't know, regardless if you're white, black, Asian, Latino, whatever. There's a deep anxiety about the world. And then at the root of that anxiety is, will you belong in the next world? And most of us do not feel very secure. And some writers, which is interesting, they're saying, so when that happens, we talk about this in the book, when you have this deep anxiety caused by rapid change, we make sense of it through stories. We're sense-making animals. And the stories, the two large stories. One story is, you're uncomfortable because of the other. If we could just get rid of the other, whether they're people crossing the border, whether they're people who have loved differently than we do, you would be better off. So all of your feelings of anxiety they become the scapegoat. That's called a breaking story. And 90+% of our stories are breaking stories. And it's not symmetrical between the right and left, but it is on both sides. And another story is just the world is changing. We don't know what it's going to be. And part of that change is a demographic change. The neighborhood you grew up in, that your parents grew up in, probably doesn't look the same. The world is changing. It's changing fast, demographically, technology. And we can't quite get a handle on it. Think about the pandemic. Think about the anxiety. The WHO came up with a thing saying, fear your neighbor, right? Everybody might be carrying a deadly disease. And I actually contacted them. I said, that's a terrible message. You're telling people to keep social distance. You should tell people to keep physical distance, but social proximity. It's the wrong message. You're saying, be afraid of everybody, right? Be afraid of the male person, So, and we're susceptible to that because we're complicated beings and most of our processes are unconscious. So DEI fall prey to that because in the midst of this anxiety, and people know something is off, and all people, then you have someone come along saying, it's the DEI people who are really the problem. And there's a kernel of truth in what they're saying in the sense that oftentimes the DEI story is demonizing the white other. We just did a study looking at the percentage of white people who organize around white dominance. And there are some. And they really believe that whites should dominate, or Western civilization, however you put it. But let me just ask, what do you think that number was? What percentage of whites do you think, assuming the study is accurate, what percentage of whites do you think organize around the need for whites to dominate?
8 to 12%.
So what?
8 to 12%.
Okay.
Around 10%.
That's pretty close, about 10%. 10%. So I'm talking to people getting up to the election. Literally, I talked to an organizer, and they're saying, we want to talk about, the resurgence of toxic whiteness and how that's driving the election. And I said, slow down, because you're really only talking about 10% of people who organize around that. Now, there's another 20% that has racial resentment. Together, they represent 30%. But they're coming from different places. And most of our stories can't carry that nuance. It's white people. And so I just was up in Alaska speaking to judges, Supreme Court. First question I get, what do you do about white privilege? Which is another way of saying all white people. Anyway, complicated question. And so one of the reasons the book is a little bit turgent is we try to unpack some of that stuff. We try to go through it systematically. So part of the reason that I shifted from talking about equity to target universalism is I felt that the practice of equity most of the time was that there was essentially good people and bad people. And it was a binary. And the admonition is we need to focus our resources on the marginalized good people, and which might mean taking resources from the dominant good people. That got translated largely in the racial justice movement to white people and black people, or white people and people of color. And I said, that's the wrong message. It's not the wrong message just because it's the wrong message. It's also not accurate. I just sent some stuff off to SEIU this morning, second largest union in the country. They spent millions of dollars trying to embrace some of our ideas. They said it wasn't working. In the last election, I forget the exact data, but 35% of their union voted for Trump. They were not happy with that. And they're saying, he's peeling off all these white people. He's telling them, you belong in my future. You don't belong in their future. And they said, we keep trying to tell them that they have to give up white privilege. And I said, look, if someone's in your union, they are much more aware of their lack of privilege. A nurse or nurse's aide that's in your union is barely getting by. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in your union. So when you talk about white privilege, if you're talking about Elon Musk and Bill Gates, okay, we can have a conversation. But you're talking about a single mom and working as a nurse's aide, trying to make a living. You haven't seen her. And so that became the toxic part of equity, of saying to that mom, that 20%, not the 10%, that 20%, saying that you should feel bad because you're white and you got all this privilege, right? So now, if we fix that, we should. It's not going to take out of 10%. people are going to still have anxiety. But can we tell a story without flattening it? People are not the same. It's the situation of most black people and most white people and most Latinos. They're all different. Can we tell a more complicated story? But our story is, how do we get everybody to thrive? Everybody to belong. And there's some concrete examples. I'll just give one, then I'll stop. One of the ways we talk about this is something called adequacy in education. Every state has a provision in it saying something to the equivalent of every student is guaranteed an adequate education. We actually took that concept and started suing states. And there's a long history. I won't take you through all the history. But Washington, for example, just came out with a case, I think it's Moore versus the state of Washington, saying there's a guarantee for every child to have an adequate education, and the state is not meeting it. You have the 20% of the students that's look like they're doing okay, and the 80% that's not. And the 80% that's not is also racially coded. State, you have an obligation to affirmatively do whatever is necessary to close the gap between the 20% and the 80%. Now, that's good, but that's equity, right? That's not target universalism, because it's saying the 20% have too much and 80% have too little. We need to do something about that. The court went on then to say the 20% doesn't have what they need to really thrive either. So you have to do something not just for the 80%, you have to do something for the 20% as well. Everybody deserves more, but different kinds of more. Now they're talking about target universalism. Now they're talking about belonging. And let's give that example because it's a concrete example. It's just been embraced by the state Supreme Court of Washington. So I think if we can make the claim to the SEIU mother living in a suburb that we care about you and we care about African Americans and we care about Latinos and we care about the people at the border, but caring about them doesn't mean we don't care about you. I think that's a much more powerful story. So that story about everybody means everybody, and it's a positive story. And I'll just end by saying this. It also has to be a sincere story. It can't be a strategic story. We have to really care about everybody.
Yes, I'm with you over there, single clapper. Thank you. So I'm just checking time, and I feel confident in asking one more good question with spaciousness for a robust full answer from each of you, and then moving into other or additional beautiful questions from our audience members, from you all. So the question that I want to move towards is one that's been brought up in both of your responses. We've mentioned bridging, and you've mentioned breaking through a number of examples as well. And when I think about bridging, in relationship to belonging and the application of belonging, or the moving towards belonging in practice, I often turn towards bridging as a frame or as a practice that helps belonging express itself more fully. I imagine it, I see it as an act of this actively expanding the circle of who we care about, or what did you say, John, earlier, the universe in which we care about. And when we are breaking, so when we're bridging, we're reaching towards one another and across difference, expanding the circle. And when we are breaking, we are fracturing the connection that could be there, that is naturally there with ourselves and others. And without a whole lot more description, I'm imagining that each of you can directly imagine, bring to mind, many forms of breaking that are alive and unfortunately taking place in all kinds of shapes and forms across societies in the world right now. So this question is getting into, okay, how do we move towards bridging? This helps us get towards belonging. And how do we Actually, I'm just going to ask the question so I don't get expansive in my thoughts. I'm going to say, what do you recommend as a pathway forward through the current multitude of breaking that is occurring within our society or within society?
John's giving me the cue, so I'll go first here. So one of the things that we say in the book is that you cannot defeat the demagogue by critiquing, condemning, saying what a bad person they are. That doesn't work, unfortunately. We just have too much experience with that. The way you defeat the demagogue, and unfortunately, again, all of our societies, from India with Modi, Turkey, we see demagoguery at sort of an apex formation right now. And with it, authoritarianism and ethnocentrism and all these ethnocracy and all these pernicious forms. The way to defeat the demagogue is with a better, more hopeful, compelling story. That's the only way to do it. So we have to have a positive story, again, where everyone belongs and everyone can see themselves in the future. What a lot of these demagogues do is they point towards the mythical past. Make America great again, or whatever it is. It's pointing towards a mythical past. And John had a great line, which we wove into the book, saying that, people are pointing towards the past, but they can't see the future that's rushing on right now. And we can't just embrace the future. We have to shape the future. We have to make the future. We have to co-create the future together. And we have to tell that story, and we have to live that story, that positive, aspirational story where we're all together. And to do that, we have to do a lot of things. And the book has, I think, a menu of them. I'm not going to go through every item on the menu, but part of it is bridging. And bridging means reaching outside of your identity group. And bridging is not about persuasion. It's really important. It's not about telling someone they're wrong and why they need to come to your side. It's about seeing their humanity. It's about psychological proximity, which builds trust. There's been an amazing amount of fascinating social psychological research on sort of persuasion and so forth. And we all know that reason, facts, data doesn't cut it. But what does cut it, if someone trusts you, they will hear you. If they trust you, they will hear you. But if you say, I'm not even going to talk to that person because they're racist or sexist or whatever, how can you even build trust? We have to bridge. We have to bridge with people we don't necessarily even feel comfortable with. That's the hard part, is bridging. So we get these questions, John. I've heard John say this in videos a million times. How do you bridge with the devil? How do you bridge with, whatever? And it's been done. How could you solve problems in Northern Ireland without bridging between Catholics and Protestants? You couldn't. How could you do it in the Balkans without the Dayton Accords between the Serbs, Protestant Serbs, and the Muslims and the Catholics? We have to do bridging. If we're going to build belonging, we have to communicate. We have to coexist. We have to live peacefully. But we cannot do it without a lot of bridging. And we have to co-create this larger story together where everyone has a positive role and no one is consigned to being the categorical permanent villain.
So Stephen is working on a book on structural racism, and he's done a compendium of examples of structural racism that's on our website you can look at now, and think of it as a teaser for his book. And I mention that because structures can actually other. So othering is not just what we do to each other. We actually live in structures, and structures shape us. So we know this when we think about the American Disabilities Act, right? So if a building, someone comes up in a wheelchair and there's no ramp, they basically send a message. You don't belong here. This is not your space. We have thousands of examples like that. Structures are not neutral. They're actually carrying certain norms and values. And we have to address that. We have to think about, we just did a thing on the back porch, right? So those of us who are older than 50, remember, porches used to be in the front. And it was a way of inviting people into a community. And there's all this research about just how much time people would take walking past someone else's house, stopping to say hello. It's not a long, protracted, curated thing. It's just, you're just walking down the street. And then in the 1960s and 70s, we start moving porches to the back and garages so that you can open it without ever getting out of your car. And I remember being recruited for a job in Dallas, and wanted to know what it was like living there. And I was talking to this guy, and I said, so what's it like, living in this neighborhood? He said, oh, it's wonderful. I've lived here for 10 years. I've never even seen my neighbors. So part of it is, how do we make structures work for us? We've done some incredible work, partially led by Stephen, about zoning. We know, sometimes deliberately, sometimes happenstance, the zoning does a lot of stuff in terms of separating people. When I moved to Miami, the realtor was showing me around. She said, well, what kind of neighborhood would you like to live in? And I said, I'd like to live in a neighborhood that's integrated racially and economically. And she looked at me, she said, where are you from? So we have to think about the structures themselves. The other thing is that we sometimes are hard on people and soft on structures. We have to flip that, to be hard on structures and soft on people. We have to challenge the othering process, not the other. It's the othering process that's doing most of the work. And people get confused or whatever. And so bridging is summed up in really one word, a South African word, sawubona, which means I see you. It's also interpreted to mean the God in me sees the God in you. It's looking not just with the eyes, but with the mind, with the heart, acknowledging someone's humanity. And sometimes we say, well, this person has nothing in common with me. In her book, Cass, Isabel Wilkinson talks about, Isabel Wilkinson, if you don't know her, she's a small African-American woman, lives in the D.C. area, and she called to have her pipes fixed because she sprung a leak. And she's, if you only have to spend 30 seconds with it to realize she's liberal, if not progressive. And this MAGA guy comes up, dressed in the full regalia. He's big, he's white, and he's also, I guess, apparently a plumber. But he's not into plumbing for her. And so they're at the house by themselves, and she's already feeling uncomfortable being in a house with a big guy, a big man, and she's a small woman, and he's giving off all kinds of hostile vibes. And he's not interested in fixing her leak. And she's getting frustrated because there's water on the floor, and he won't even look to see where the water is coming from. And so at some point she said, for some reason a question came to her mind. And she said, how's your mom? And she says, she saw the guy tear up. And he said, my mom passed 2 years ago. And she said, so did mine. And within no time at all, they've connected. And now the guy's not only fixing her leak, he's saying, I got a bunch of tools outside, and what else do you need? Not what is your position on abortion, not what do you think about the war. It's like, I see you're a human being. Again, you could have said those two people have nothing in common, but that's a fiction. So I know we're going to open up. I just want to make two other quick points. From my perspective, not necessarily from others, from my perspective, we all belong. Full stop. We may not live our life that way. We may create structures and institutions that say otherwise. But to take Jefferson's word, there are certain truths that are self-evident, that all human beings belong, period. They don't have to prove they belong, don't have to have a certain amount of money, don't have to have a certain... Everybody belongs, but we haven't organized our society to reflect that. And I think that's the charge. How do we organize our societies to reflect that? And I want to also suggest that's hard work, but it's wonderful work. It's joyous work. And I'm just really happy that all of you signed up to be part of that work.
I hate to follow John's poetry with a more prosaic comment, but I wanted to add one final note on this. So we live in a society that's centrifugal, it's spinning, and we're pulling apart, instead of one that's centripetal. And the porch is just one example of many. There's a John's comment led me down a rabbit hole. I found a famous essay from the 70s called From Porch to Patio, where someone was observing this trend and the social implications of it, where just the familiarity, the accidental interactions with neighbors and familiarity, people are in the back facing inward instead of outward. But our entire society is organized like that. The fact that 100 years ago, people were in streetcars, now we're in private cars. The fact that we have single-family zoning instead of communal living. People 150 years ago were mostly or often in extended family homes or SROs. Instead, we live in detached units. More and more of us are alone. More Americans are living alone than ever before. It leads to a profound sense of loneliness and lack of togetherness. And when you survey Americans, it doesn't matter whether you're bright red in MAGA country or, Berkeley. They all say we want more community and we want more togetherness. Yet our institutions and our cultural practices do not facilitate that. So we have to rethink not just the stories we want to tell, but the institutions that we live with and our cultural practices if we want this society of belonging without othering.
Thank you both for that response and for every response you've shared. I want to just prime that as if the discussion on bridging that was just warmed up here was of interest and you see it as a powerful next step forward, you're right. And John is releasing a book on early December, I think December 4th, called The Power of Bridging. And as I started today's talk saying that this book was identified as the book of the year, that book is already forecasted as the next big idea. And so I want to warmly welcome you all into pre-ordering that. Or two. Yes, thank you. Audience reminder.
Bring holiday friends.
Okay, so now I'm looking to my OBI colleagues who might be running a mic or identifying where there could be Christian, thank you. Okay, I see a pocket right over here. Yes, please identify yourselves, and the golden rule of this is to please be sure to ask a question. Thank you.
Hi. First, I want to say thank you to all of you for the very good and hopeful work that you do. It seems to me that one of the threats to belonging is a belief system in majority populations of the zero-sum game, and that if you get something you need, you're taking something from me. For you to get something, I lose. And how can we foster belonging in a sense of coming together if people have that notion that anything that benefits you hurts me?
You want to take a couple questions, or we just have our response?
How do you do? A couple of questions, and then I think I like to see them weave together really beautiful tapestries of answers. So how about we take a couple of questions, and then we'll have them respond to all of them, each of them.
So
Tell us your name if you don't mind.
I'm Dorian. Go Bears. Okay, sorry. So my question is, so I think you mentioned about looking forward of creating a future or story that everybody has a place in it. I'm curious about intergeneration healing and identity work, because I was thinking about how nowadays I think, especially the popular culture, social media, like people become superficial about their identity. So that's why there's a black and white, or you has to be this or the other. But I feel that if we do invest more in terms of our identity work, and then we will find a lot more, I wouldn't say gray areas, but a lot more commonality, a lot more places to bridge instead of breaking. So, yeah.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Larry Best, and totally love this conversation. And I'm on board, and the hard part is the details and the next steps. And, you know, I struggle in my own thinking about this as trained in political science, the institutions versus the individual. And, you know, it can become a bit of a loop. And I'm sanguine that there's now the Democracy Policy Initiative at, you know, the Golden School here. And so I want to ask you, one part of my question is, so to really dig into the institutional part, and I think they're, you know, trying to get to that, and it requires, as they speak about it, at the Democracy Policy Initiative, that people feel like they have a stake, that it matters. And that's the problem, is that people don't. Which reminds me of if we look at the DNC convention a couple months ago, and it was there was a lot of belonging happening. It was really beautiful, I thought. And yet, we're 8 days out, and we've gone, so, you know, othering because the other side's othering. So I use that as a kind of example of now, and then so you could either speak to that and or how the work of, you know, another institute here is focusing on the institutional piece and how your work can get us out of this morass so that we're not in this constant cycle.
Okay, yes, I feel like that pocket was rich with questions.
Well, you go first. So the first, in terms of zero sum, you're absolutely correct. Say zero sum is a fertile ground for breaking, because basically saying somebody's going to lose. And oftentimes we start with a scarcity mentality, you know, which is kind of interesting, right? And there's a way of reframing and thinking about these things. Robert Sapolsky down at Stanford, he makes the observation that most wars, if not violent conflict, have been fought over sacred symbols. And, you know, on first blush, that might seem like, no, aren't they fighting over land? Or he said, no, really it's so. And then you think, oh yeah, there was that 100-year war. What were they fighting about? About whose God was the biggest God, or whose God had, you know, whatever. I mean, literally, 2 and 3 generations sending their sons off to die in holy wars. I mean, today that seems crazy, because it is crazy. And so why I'm saying that is that our material stuff is always going to be finite. But in terms of giving and acknowledging people with dignity, there's not a finite amount of dignity we can give. We can actually dignify everyone. And we've done a lot around TU, and I know that, again, the Equity Project is here. When people hear that Group A is going to get more than Group B, but Group B is going to get something too, and here's why, they're actually okay with it. They're okay with it. We actually do something to be a little bit more concrete. We do something called opportunity mapping, where we map out the distribution of opportunity. We did this with California Endowment, and then we had different groups sort of see where they were geo-coded in terms of who had more stuff. So, for example, in Texas, there was an effort to have parks within a mile of where you live. Well, some communities had 3 parks within a mile of where you live, so you're not going to get another park. Some communities didn't have a park within 5 miles. So the city investing money in those parks that didn't have the park within 5 miles, there was no pushback. Oh, wait, and those communities that don't have parks, they're almost all Latino. So it wasn't saying we're going to give something to Latinos because they're Latinos. It was saying everybody should have a park, and they don't have them. And then in terms of stories, here's something that's a little bit counterintuitive. We do better with more complicated stories. But oftentimes when we talk about the other, it's a very simple story. What do we know about the other? Isabel Wilkins didn't know this guy's mother had died 2 years ago. he came in with a MAGA hat, she knows he's a Trump supporter. So oftentimes we know the other in two-dimensional terms, not really much at all. So how do we tell a more complex story? So the point that you make in terms of when we tell a more complex story, it creates new possibilities of finding commonality. But these simple stories create binaries. And that's why I told the story about only 10% of whites. I wish it was only 1%. I wish it was none. But still, only 10% of whites are organized around racial dominance. It's interesting. When other whites hear that, they actually are mad at that 10%, right? But oftentimes in our discourses, white people or black people or Latinos, instead of telling a more complicated story. And yes, we'll work with the Goldman School. We think the dean over there and the work they're doing is great. But we're also doing stuff as well. And so like you may know that virtually every city is rethinking its zoning policies. That's partially a result of our work, and Stephen in particular. People don't think about zoning as a organizing, othering mechanism. It's exactly that, right? And sometimes we have to be able to tell a story without a villain, right? Because like, okay, say, all right, zoning in Elmwood, well, maybe there was a villain there, but they zone basically for white only. But sometimes there's stuff that happens and there's no villain behind it. There's a spider web and there's no spider. So we spend, it's like, where's the spider? Just fix the web. And so there are a lot of examples like that. And learning from Belfast or Northern Ireland, learning from Chile, learning from people who have been through incredibly violent conflict and at least partially come out of the other side. We've been having with Care Lab, for the last 2 or 3 years, we've been having dinners. I think a series of 3 dinners between people in D.C. on the Republican side and Democratic side who are at the Senate level. And it's going extremely well. The difficult thing is, looking at Cecily, we can't talk about it publicly. The Democrats are afraid that if the other Democrat constituents know they're meeting with Republicans and having a nice dinner, they won't get reelected. The Republicans are afraid that so it's like they will have the conversation, they will even build trust, they will actually even pass bills, but you can't talk about it yet. It's a private event. So we have to change that. We have to change the incentive so that instead of being punished for bridging, you're rewarded for bridging.
I'll just add a couple of things. We want to get more of you into the conversation. There are a couple of stories in the later chapters of the book that sort of talk about leaders who have told these more hopeful, future-oriented stories and embodied it. An obvious one is Mandela, the Rainbow Nation. A less obvious one, but perhaps equally important, is Mary Robinson, who was the president of Ireland, who inaugurated and ushered this new Ireland concept where everyone, they could move beyond some of the traditional ideas. It put Ireland on a completely different trajectory, and to this day is still one of the most popular European leaders, even though she hasn't been in the presidency for, over a decade or so. To the zero-sum question, some things are zero-sum. Not everything, though. And the number of things that aren't zero-sum is hard to appreciate. So it's like, it may feel zero-sum. Can we just give every kid school lunch? Can we do that? There's economies of scale in doing that. It may seem zero-sum, but it's not. Now, voting is probably zero-sum. If you vote, someone gets to vote someone. But in some real sense, it's not. We feel an expansive sense of democracy when more and more people can participate. There are some things that are zero-sum, but much of the economy is not zero-sum. You take $1 and you channel it through 5 businesses. That is positive sum. So much of our world is more positive sum, but the stories we're told feel zero-sum. So that's the problem, is the stories and narratives we have we're told are zero-sum when they're really much more likely to be positive sum.
Affirmative action is a great example. And this is one of my pet peeves. And so every couple of years there's a new, maybe now it's over, right? But every couple of years there's a new attack on affirmative action. And there's a storyline with it, what it means. Why are there so many or so few, depending on your perspective, Black and Latino kids going to school at Berkeley and Stanford when, they didn't test as well as some other kids, right? And so we end up fighting for this elite schools, and we put the fight in terms of zero sum. I think a mistake on a lot of levels. I think there's another story, another practice. And I asked the question, there was a few years ago, there were 900 students, mainly Latino, but some Black, who sued and lost because they didn't get into Berkeley or UCLA. They had 4.0. They had perfect scores on their grades. They'd gotten 4.0, which means all A's for those of you who've been out of school a long time. The average student coming into Berkeley has a 4.3. Yeah, 4.3. How do you have a 4.3, right? It's AP classes. AP classes give you a boost. So those kids go to schools where there are no AP classes. So they did everything they possibly could have done at those schools, and they still don't get into Berkeley, right? And they sued and they lost. Okay. And then we sued and my question is this. We have these really brilliant young kids in Berkeley, Black, Latino. Sotomayor said, brilliance is everywhere, opportunity is not. Why are we suing the state saying, build another Berkeley? If we got thousands of students who are clearly qualified, who are clearly brilliant, but we say, we don't have room for you. We've been able to build more prisons, but we can't build more universities. So I've been waiting for someone to sue the state saying, as a state, you're supposed to provide a ladder for these students, and you're not doing it. And even if you lose, just to change the discourse. So it's not between this brilliant white student and this brilliant Latino students. Both of you go for it. And realize, as you go for it, as you get this great education at Berkeley or Stanford, wherever you go, it's a public good. It's not something you hoard yourself. But anyway, that's shifting the discussion away from zero sum. Can we think about how we all benefit? And if the resources are too, I'll tell you one more story. I work with a foundation in Sacramento. They had done a study and they found out that Black infants were dying at 5 times the rate of white children, and Latinos were dying at 3 times the rate of white children, and white children were dying too high, at a higher rate. And so they had limited resources. So they said, we are going to give all the money that we have, which is limited, to the Black students. And there was an internal fight because they had been reading some of our stuff, and I had been there to talk to them a couple of times, and they were saying, this is not what Professor Powell suggested in terms of targeted universalism. We shouldn't. We have limited resources. We have to make some priorities, and Blacks have been left out a long time. They went back and forth, so they asked me to come back. And they said, what would you suggest we do? And I said, well, it's your money, sort of, because I believe in commonwealth. I don't believe anyone really controls it. It's anyone's wealth. I don't, $200 billion doesn't belong to Elon Musk. It belongs to all of us. That's another story. But I said I would not give all the money to the Black families. I would give a disproportionate amount to the Black families, but I'd also give some to Latino families, and I'd also give some to the white families. And I'd tell a story about it as to why you were doing it. To add meaning, for you not to wait for some conflict entrepreneur to interpret your actions. You need to interpret your actions. And your actions, the story should be something like, we don't have enough resources, but we care about everybody. Everybody counts. And so this is how we're managing that. And they did it. And what happened was, with that story and that practice, resources flooded in. And they were able to actually do something for all the families.
Okay. We have just about got to the end of the time that we've scheduled for tonight. But I don't want to leave you with just, like, I know we promised one more question, so I am going to field one final question and an answer, and mostly because I want to also stay true to my promise and our intention of feeding you and having drinks together and communing and having conversation. So the thing I want to also plug is, if you don't get to ask your question in this particular forum, please know that this forum is taking a different shape. Ask a neighbor. Ask John and Stephen while they're up here signing books. Write in an email. However your question lives on. But please, Christian.
Do a batch of like 2 or 3 for a final thing?
If you would like, I mean, it's your night, Stephen, so two questions, and then it's a wrap, folks.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful conversation. I'm curious, as you were talking about kind of indigenous folks, and I'm wondering what the role is of the cosmologies and the stories of belonging that have been unbroken or still exist, and the role they have in this time.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Tara McGrew, and thank you so much for this space. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I have like 3 in one question. One is, when did competition come into all this to create that whole separateness in the evolution of the human species? Secondly, I'm getting back to where you just blew my mind when you said belonging. You said that we would have to othering. Those says othering is a misguided attempt to belonging. And then you said, you went into talking about how we have to create a script. So, like, in my head, it's like, okay, this is good. Because I could create anything in my head, but I have to bring it into a tangible form, into the human form, so that we can all relate. I just got a little confused there, because if it's a misguided attempt, then that means we have to start thinking about it differently. And that's what shocked the whole way of my thinking pattern, which I like and thank you. But then you said that we have to, which I believe, we have to move towards a future where we're creating a script. But isn't that what we've been doing? Creating a script of separateness. And so I know that we're all practitioners. We are, and I'm right now in the formation of creating stories to make connections, and it seems that that's a sort of a reoccurring theme this evening. And I take that in my practice with people as I am trying to dismantle racism and those structures. But then if we are coming back and we're creating a different script, isn't that sort of going back to the same script? Or is it just a different variation of a script that we're creating? Did that make sense? Thank you. Thank you.
Very quickly, I mean, first of all, these are great questions, and I realize, and I appreciate them, and I realize we're not necessarily spending the time that they all deserve. So we are creating stories all the time, period. Can we consciously create stories? And it's not that I create a story or you create a story. We have to have all of our stories. So also part of belonging is you get to tell your story. And I oftentimes say, so you tell your story, it's a long answer, but the short answer is, who's the audience for your story? Who are you talking to? And one audience member that I want you to make prominent in your story is the lizard. Right? The lizard. And the lizard, for those of you who are new to this, the lizard is the amygdala, the old part of the brain that we share with the lizard that's organized around fear. That's part of your audience. Talk to the lizard. The lizard doesn't speak research. The lizard doesn't speak data. And the lizard is afraid. What is the lizard afraid of? The lizard is most afraid of not belonging. So when the Proud Boys are marching in Charlottesville, they're telling you, the lizard is on full display. They're not hiding lizard. The lizard is saying, the Jews will not replace us. What is that telling you? First of all, it's not factual. You don't go to them and say, excuse me, there are no Jews who want to replace you. That's talking to the front of the brain. That's not talking to the lizard. The lizard is saying, I'm afraid that I'm not going to belong. So the stories you have to tell is that you are going to belong. Everybody's going to belong. And what's your story? Tell me your story. It's not enough for you to hear my story. And I could go on and on. I'll just give you one other example. I spoke to 400 or 500 people who were all mega people. I was put in front of them to try to convince them to have Medicaid expansion. My host, as he was pushing me out on the stage, he said, we had somebody here 2 weeks ago talking about this. They were booed off the stage. Good luck. And I walked on the stage, and I started off with a lie. I said, it's good to be here. My lizard was saying, man, what the hell? But what I did is I went around the room, and I said, I want you to tell your story. I want you to tell your story about healthcare. Have you lost insurance, any of you, because of your children having a pre-existing condition, or you losing your job, or your doctor prescribed something and the insurance company says no? And I said to stand up. If any of those things, and by 2 or 3 more questions, everybody's standing up. And then I said, before I get to my remarks, I want to hear your story. Tell me your story about that. Now there are no folded arms. Everybody's completely animated. They're yelling and cussing out the insurance companies. And at the end of the session, they tell the host, we like this guy. Can you have him come back? What they were really saying is, this guy saw us. This guy saw our lizard. And he didn't say, you're stupid to believe that they're going to kill your grandmother, which is, in the New York Times, that the mega people are basically. So that's the way you do it. You elicit not just your story, but other people's story as well. And it's not just Democrats and Republicans. Had a friend talk to last night about Dan Siegel. Dan Siegel has a thing where he says, with children, when they act out, connect and redirect. Start off with connecting. Start off with connecting. Instead, we start off with redirecting. Not just with children, with each other. You just said something really stupid. Let me tell you how stupid that is. I don't feel connected. In fact, I'm feeling mad, right? Talk to the lizard.
Well, again, I hate to follow up poetry with prose, but I'm going to do it. So there is a wonderful TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, American Nigerian author, called The Danger of a Single Story. And it goes to your question, Dorian, about really the flattening that happens to our identities, that we can't just reduce our identities to a single identity. I was working with John on the manuscript. He'd send me over manuscript texts, and often my breath would be taken away by a wonderful line. One of my favorite lines in the book is where he wrote, one of the keys to belonging is embracing our multiplicity and fluidity. We have to do that. We have to resist essentialism, And so that means really leaning into broader identities, doing more bridging, recognizing our multiplicity. And there's a lot in the book about that. I won't go into too much about that. But part of it is the stories we tell around identities, not allowing to flatten us into a single identity. Unfortunately, we live in a society right now, and have for some time, that's not just radically individualism, but it's radically separate. So we are separate from each other. We don't just live in separate homes and drive in separate cars, and we also have a real sense of separation from the planet and from each other. And that is partly a product of Enlightenment thought. The subject-object duality, the human-non-human duality, reason over emotion. And the amazing thing about sort of the last 100 years of science, and really the last 30 years, is it's radically overturning that. Everything we thought about cognition and emotion turns out to be wrong. It's radically integrated into our, and I think that's actually getting us back to these pre-Enlightenment epistemologies, our recognition of our radical entanglement, right? Our radical embodiment. And we have to get back to that. And we have to do that without jettisoning the things we like about liberal democracy and liberalism, but we have to usher ourselves into the next paradigm. And that's our next project.
I want to thank you all for contributing to a lovely evening. I want to remind you that there are books available just in the lobby, and John and Stephen will be signing books for a little while here this evening over here at this table. We do have food and drink that Ivan is pointing towards now being in the hallway. Okay, not outside anymore. It is towards the hallway. And last but not least, I just want to end with tremendous gratitude for each of you for showing up and contributing to this event, for the belonging builders you are and will be when you leave this room and during your time here, and to OBI staff and everybody who helped contribute to this event and make it wonderful and available for each of us. And last but certainly not least, to John and Stephen for the tremendous amount of work and love they put into writing and offering this book, and for what it will bring to each of us. Thank you.
You've been listening to Berkeley Talks, a UC Berkeley News podcast from the Office of Communications and Public Affairs that features lectures and conversations at UC Berkeley. Follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can find all of our podcast episodes with transcripts and photos on UC Berkeley News at news.berkeley.edu/podcasts.